The ancient cobblestones of Rome trembled under the weight of German half-tracks as they rolled through the narrow streets where Caesars once paraded in triumph. September had arrived with a darkness that had nothing to do with autumn. As Nazi soldiers in field-grey uniforms positioned machine-gun nests at intersections that had stood peaceful for centuries, the Eternal City, which had survived barbarian invasions and plague, now faced a new terror as swastika banners unfurled from buildings where Renaissance masters had once painted their dreams. In the Jewish quarter near the Teatro di Marcello, families who had called Rome home for 2,000 years began burning documents and sewing jewelry into coat linings, their hands shaking with the knowledge of what was coming. The occupation had begun, and with it, a countdown to unspeakable horror. Beyond the chaos, across the Tiber River, the dome of St. Peter's Basilica rose like a stone prayer against the September sky. The Vatican had declared itself neutral territory, an island of sanctuary, surrounded by a sea of violence, protected only by centuries-old treaties that now seemed as fragile as parchment. Swiss guards in their colorful Renaissance uniforms stood at their posts, ceremonial halberds in hand, facing German sentries with modern rifles just meters away. Pope Pius XII had chosen the path of diplomatic silence, believing that neutrality might protect both the Church and those sheltering within its walls. But neutrality, as some would soon discover, could become complicity if good men chose to do nothing. In the working-class neighborhoods beyond Vatican walls, German officers moved door to door with lists of names written in meticulous Gothic script. Jewish families heard the boots on staircases, the pounding on wooden doors, the shouted commands in a language that sounded like breaking glass. Children clutched their mothers as neighbors watched from darkened windows, afraid to intervene, afraid to even witness what was unfolding before them. The trucks arrived at dawn and departed at dusk, packed with human cargo destined for places whose names would later become synonyms for evil. Yet even as darkness descended on Rome, there were those who refused to accept that the city of saints would become a city of bystanders. In the corridors of the Vatican, an unusually tall Irish priest was about to make a decision that would transform him from observer to outlaw. Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty cut an unmistakable figure in the shadowed corridors of the Holy Office, standing well over 6 feet tall with the broad shoulders of a Kerry farmer and the easy smile of a man who had never quite lost his love of sport despite the cassock he wore. His Irish brogue still coloured his Italian after years in Rome, and Vatican staff had grown accustomed to seeing him striding through St. Peter's Square at dawn, breviary in one hand, golf club in the other, heading to practice his swing on a makeshift course he had fashioned behind the Gregorian University. He had come to Rome as a young seminary student decades earlier, risen through the diplomatic ranks with intelligence and charm, and settled into comfortable duties, recording martyrs and maintaining church archives. But comfort, he was about to discover, had an expiration date when history knocked on your door with the sound of jackboots and screams. The first time he witnessed a roundup, O'Flaherty had been returning from a morning walk, his long strides carrying him toward the Vatican, just as German trucks surrounded a block of apartments near the portico of Octavia. He watched from behind a stone column as soldiers dragged an elderly man down marble steps, the old one's kipper falling to the cobblestones as his wife reached desperately toward him. Before being shoved into the truck beside him, a child's shoe lay abandoned in the gutter, small and brown and heartbreaking in its emptiness. O'Flaherty's hands, usually so steady whether holding a rosary or a 9-iron, trembled as they gripped the ancient stone. Something fundamental shifted inside him in that moment, a transformation as complete as lightning splitting an oak, and he knew with absolute certainty that his life of comfortable scholarship had just ended. That evening, he climbed the narrow stairs to his modest room in the German college within Vatican walls, where books lined shelves and a simple wooden desk faced a window overlooking Rome's terracotta rooftops. He sat in the gathering darkness without lighting a lamp, watching smoke rise from chimneys where families prepared supper, wondering how many of those families would still be there tomorrow. His conscience, shaped by the green hills of County Cork and the strict moral certainty of his mother's kitchen table faith, spoke to him in a voice that left no room for debate or diplomatic nuance. The Vatican might choose neutrality, might calculate the cost of intervention against the price of silence, but Hugh O'Flaherty was done calculating. He pulled a sheet of Vatican stationery toward him, lit the small desk lamp with hands that had stopped shaking, and began to write the first of what would become thousands of forged documents, each one a small paper rebellion against the machinery of genocide rolling through his beloved adopted city. The Vatican existed in those dark months as a theological paradox made stone and marble, 110 acres of sovereignty, surrounded entirely by occupied territory where the swastika now flew from, government buildings that had once housed the eagles of ancient Rome. Pope Pius XII, a man of aristocratic bearing and diplomatic training who had served as papal nuncio in Germany, walked a razor's edge of neutrality that left him sleepless through countless nights, his private apartments illuminated until dawn as he wrestled with prayers and political calculations that would haunt historians for generations. The Holy See maintained relations with both Allied and Axis powers, its ambassadors speaking carefully chosen words that offended no one and committed to nothing. A dance of diplomatic survival that protected the Church's global mission while Rome's streets ran red with consequences. O'Flaherty understood the position, even sympathized with its terrible logic, but understanding did not mean he could accept it when children's shoes lay empty in gutters and families vanished into boxcars heading north. The invisible boundary at St. Peter's Square possessed an almost mystical quality, that white travertine line, where Vatican territory ended and occupied Rome began, a border that existed more in international law than physical barriers, yet held absolute power in that moment of history. German soldiers patrolled right up to that line, their boots stopping precisely at the edge as if an invisible wall rose there, their orders from Berlin clear that Vatican. Neutrality must be respected, even as they showed no mercy beyond its borders. O'Flaherty began spending hours standing just inside that line, his tall figure in black cassock visible from across the piazza, watching refugees approach with desperate eyes, some clutching papers, others carrying nothing but hope and terror in equal measure. He developed signals, subtle gestures that meant safety or danger, a hand to his collar that told a frightened family to wait, a turn toward the colonnade that meant follow at a distance, an entire silent language conducted in plain sight of soldiers who suspected but could not prove what was happening, steps from their rifles. Inside the Apostolic Palace, O'Flaherty discovered that Vatican documents carried weight beyond their religious purpose, that a paper bearing the Holy See's seal and the right stamps could transform a Jewish father into a Catholic priest, a mother into a nun, children into orphans under church protection with baptismal certificates backdated to infancy. The Vatican printing office, normally producing missals and encyclicals, became his frequent destination, where a sympathetic Monsignor asked no questions when O'Flaherty requisitioned yet another stack of official stationery and wax for seals. He taught himself forgery with the dedication he had once applied to theology, studying authentic documents under lamplight until he could reproduce every flourish of Vatican calligraphy, every subtle watermark that distinguished genuine papers from crude fakes that would get someone killed at a checkpoint. Each document he created was a prayer written in ink instead of spoken, a sacrament of survival administered outside any church's official doctrine. The moral mathematics of his position became clear during a meeting with the Vatican Secretary of State, a silver-haired cardinal who spoke in measured tones about the greater good and the millions of Catholics worldwide whose safety depended on papal neutrality being maintained. O'Flaherty listened respectfully, his large hands folded across his cassock, And when the cardinal finished, the Irish priest simply said that he understood completely and would of course act according to his conscience as a priest of Christ, which was not agreement at all, but rather a polite declaration of independence that both men recognized. He left that office knowing he walked alone now, that any protection his Irish passport and Vatican position offered would evaporate the moment his activities became too visible, too embarrassing to the delicate diplomatic structure that kept the church functioning. But walking alone was something a Kerry man understood, and as he descended the marble stairs toward the street level where desperate families waited, in shadows, Hugh O'Flaherty felt more certain of his path than he had of anything since the day of his ordination. The network began not with grand planning but with desperate improvisation. 3 people gathered in O'Flaherty's small room on a November evening while rain hammered against the window and the lights of occupied Rome flickered beyond. The Vatican walls. Father Borg, a Maltese priest whose gentle face concealed an iron will forged during years of missionary work in dangerous territories, sat on the narrow bed examining blank identity cards with the concentration of a jeweler assessing diamonds. Beside him stood Sister Katharina, a German nun whose opposition to the regime that had consumed her homeland showed in every tight line around her mouth, her hands steady as she mixed inks that would age documents to look months old rather than hours fresh. O'Flaherty worked at his small desk, his tall frame hunched over papers, practicing signatures of Vatican officials he had studied until he could reproduce them sleeping. While outside, the rain provided cover for those first refugees making their way toward addresses he had whispered through the confessional screen that afternoon. The system evolved with each family saved, becoming more sophisticated as the stakes grew higher and the hunters more determined. O'Flaherty recruited an Italian aristocrat whose palazzo held secret rooms built during previous occupations centuries past, chambers behind false walls where Jews could vanish completely while soldiers searched the floors above. He brought in a British major who'd escaped a prisoner transport and now used his military training to organize safe-house rotations, moving people every few days to prevent neighbors from noticing patterns that might reach informant ears. A Swiss count with diplomatic immunity became their courier, carrying messages sewn into coat linings through checkpoints where German soldiers waved him past with bored salutes. Each member brought skills that fit together like pieces of a puzzle, designed by providence rather than planning, forming something larger than any individual could have created alone. The small room became a factory of false identities, operating in hours stolen from official duties and sleep. O'Flaherty would finish his day's work at the Holy Office, attend evening prayers with innocent punctuality, then return to his quarters where his real vocation waited in stacks of paper and bottles of ink. He created priests who had never taken orders, nuns who had never entered convents, Vatican employees with entirely fictional histories supported by forged work records and residence permits. Each document required not just technical skill, but imagination, constructing lives that could withstand questioning. Complete with hometown details from Italian villages O'Flaherty had visited during happier years when he walked those streets with nothing heavier than a breviary in his pocket. The network's first major test came when a family of 7 appeared at midnight, having escaped a raid by hiding in a coal cellar for 16 hours. O'Flaherty looked at the exhausted parents, the 5 children ranging from infant to teenager, and knew that his small operation had just become something far larger and more dangerous than anything he had imagined that first night. He sent runners through dark streets to activate safe houses, distributed documents he had prepared for exactly this moment, and watched as his carefully recruited allies moved with practiced efficiency to make 7 people disappear into a city crawling with those who hunted them. By dawn, the system operated with the precision of a Swiss watch, each component moving in synchronized rhythm, though separated by miles of hostile streets. O'Flaherty stood at his window as first light touched Rome's ancient rooftops, watching a bread delivery cart roll past the Vatican gates, knowing that beneath loaves still warm from the oven lay identity papers for 3 families scheduled to move that morning. The baker, a widow whose son had been taken for forced labor in Germany, never spoke during these exchanges, simply accepted the shopping list O'Flaherty handed her with items underlined in sequences that indicated addresses and timing. Her cart would wind through morning markets where a fishmonger's wife would purchase bread and discover documents wrapped in wax paper, then continue the chain until papers reached trembling hands in darkened rooms across the city. The silence between these strangers spoke louder than any oath, each risking everything for people whose faces they would never see. The Vatican itself became a labyrinth of hidden passages and forgotten spaces that O'Flaherty mapped with obsessive detail. He discovered storage rooms sealed since Napoleon's occupation, chambers behind, heating ducts where the warmth disguised body heat from any detector, unused sections of the massive building where footsteps echoed down corridors patrolled only by mice and memories. In these spaces, families lived in whispered existence, children learning to play silent games with cloth balls and stifled laughter while their parents aged years. In weeks, O'Flaherty visited during hours when legitimate business took him past unmarked doors, carrying food in briefcases meant for documents, medicine hidden in prayer books, and most precious of all, news from the outside world that proved life continued beyond their confinement. He became their link to hope, his tall figure appearing like an angel in priest's robes, always with a smile that promised tomorrow would come, despite the darkness pressing against today. The coded messages evolved into an intricate language, understood by initiated ears alone. During Sunday masses that Germans attended for appearance's sake, hymn selections signaled safe house availability, sermon topics indicated which neighborhoods faced increased patrols, and the number of candles lit at particular altars told runners where documents awaited collection. A chalice positioned left of center meant proceed with planned movements, while right placement screamed danger through silent symbolism. Confessional booths became command centers where O'Flaherty received intelligence whispered through ornate screens. Resistors, posing as penitent Catholics, delivering information about troop movements and upcoming raids while seeking absolution they didn't need. Every religious ritual transformed into tactical communication, ancient practices serving purposes their creators never imagined. Faith and resistance becoming inseparable in the shadow of occupation. At night, O'Flaherty stood at that same window, watching darkness conceal his human cargo, moving between sanctuaries, each shadow potentially containing life he had touched. The rain fell again, washing cobblestones clean, while history wrote itself in invisible ink across the eternal city. Somewhere in that darkness, families breathed easier behind false walls, soldiers healed in monastery infirmaries, and children dreamed of freedom in convent attics, while his network spread wider with each passing hour. Herbert Kapler's office in Via Tasso radiated the cold efficiency of a man who treated human suffering as statistical. Data walls lined with filing cabinets containing indexed cards documenting every Jewish family, every suspected partisan, every whisper of resistance in occupied Rome. He sat behind his desk on that October morning when the report arrived, a single sheet of paper that ignited something dangerous behind his pale blue eyes as he read about Vatican. Passes appearing on Jews scheduled for deportation, identity papers too expertly forged to be amateur work, a pattern suggesting organization where chaos should reign. The SS lieutenant colonel crushed his cigarette with deliberate pressure, studying the map of Rome spread before him, where red pins marked failed raids and suspects who vanished. Like smoke, all trails leading to one impossible destination. "Someone inside the Vatican," he said to his deputy, the words tasting like both challenge and opportunity. "Someone believes that collar provides immunity from consequences." The investigation began with Gestapo thoroughness, agents photographing everyone entering and leaving Vatican. A territory, matching faces against intelligence files, while informants embedded among Rome's population reported conversations overheard in markets and churches. Kapler personally reviewed surveillance reports, his methodical mind assembling fragments into patterns until one name surfaced repeatedly in whispered warnings that preceded every vanishing act. Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty, an Irish priest whose height made him memorable, whose movements through Rome suggested purposes beyond pastoral duties, whose rooms in the German college overlooked routes used by his underground railroad. Kapler obtained photographs showing O'Flaherty's distinctive figure striding across St. Peter's Square, that confident bearing of someone who believed himself untouchable, and the German officer felt predatory satisfaction recognizing a worthy opponent. "So the Irish think they can interfere in German affairs," he murmured, tracing Vatican borders on his map with one finger, calculating angles of approach while diplomatic immunity created invisible walls his authority could not breach. Spies deployed around Vatican perimeters like patient spiders spinning surveillance webs, watching O'Flaherty's patterns, noting contacts, documenting the priest's network through association and proximity. Kapler installed himself in cafes, offering views of St. Peter's Square, sipping bitter coffee, while studying the demarcation line separating his jurisdiction from papal sovereignty, that invisible boundary representing everything his ordered mind despised about this assignment. The hunter recognized his quarry's advantage, territorial sanctuary that transformed pursuit into chess match, but Herbert Kapler had broken better men than Irish. Priests had extracted confessions from partisans who believed themselves martyrs, had sent thousands eastward in cattle cars without losing sleep. He would simply need patience, strategy, and willingness to exploit any moment when faith made O'Flaherty careless enough to step beyond that protective line into German hands waiting to close around him like iron jaws. The white line appeared at dawn, painted across cobblestones at St. Peter's Square's edge, in fresh chalk that glowed against ancient stone, Kapler's personal message declaring boundaries and intentions. Vatican guards discovered it during morning rounds, that stark warning visible from O'Flaherty's window where the priest stood watching sunrise paint Rome in deceptive beauty, understanding immediately that anonymity had died and open warfare now defined his mission. The game had changed from rescue operation to personal duel, hunter and hunted both knowing the other's position, circling each other across that white line while thousands of lives hung balanced between them. The nun's habit smelled of mothballs and old incense when O'Flaherty pulled it over his tall frame in the dusty sacristy of Santa Maria in Trastevere, his 6'2" stature making the disguise almost comical, except for the deadly stakes that transformed absurdity into survival. Sister Benedetta, barely 5 feet herself, suppressed nervous laughter while adjusting the veil over his angular Irish features, her wrinkled hands shaking as she understood that German eyes now watched every entrance to Vatican territory, searching for that distinctive silhouette. "Keep your head down, Monsignor," she whispered, "and remember to take smaller steps. Nuns don't stride like golfers crossing the green." O'Flaherty nodded, feeling the rosary beads heavy in his borrowed pocket, aware that beyond these ancient walls, Kapler's agents waited with photograph folders and trained recognition, ready to signal the moment their quarry emerged. The church bells rang vespers as he shuffled into twilight Rome, shoulders hunched, eyes downcast, becoming invisible through theatrical transformation while his heart hammered against ribs that understood one mistake meant Via Tasso's torture cells. The street vendor disguise came weeks later, when a Jewish family needed extraction from an apartment surrounded by Gestapo surveillance. O'Flaherty pushing a wooden cart loaded with bruised apples through narrow cobblestone lanes where suspicion hung thick as cooking smoke. He darkened his face with coal dust, adopted the hunched posture of Rome's struggling poor, called out prices in rough Italian that masked his Cork accent beneath manufactured weariness. German soldiers barely glanced at another shabby peddler navigating morning markets, their attention focused on doorways and windows rather than the poverty rendered invisible by its ubiquity. O'Flaherty positioned his cart below the targeted apartment, arranging fruit while singing a folk song that served as coded signal, watching through peripheral vision as frightened faces appeared briefly at curtains above. The mother descended first with forged papers hidden in her daughter's doll, then the elderly father, whose yellow star had been hastily removed, leaving ghost outline on worn fabric, each casualty of hatred climbing into O'Flaherty's cart beneath burlap sacks that smelled of earth and desperate hope. The chimney sweep transformation required complete commitment to grime, O'Flaherty coating himself in authentic soot collected from monastery fireplaces until even his teeth appeared blackened, carrying brushes and rope that jangled with working-class legitimacy. This disguise granted access to Roman rooftops, where his network moved refugees between safe houses through aerial pathways, invisible to street-level surveillance, scrambling across terracotta tiles while Kapler's men watched ground entrances below. He guided escaped Allied prisoners across this elevated landscape, whispering directions in English while pretending to inspect chimneys, his black-coated figure blending into Rome's smoky skyline like urban camouflage. Each crossing meant dancing along edges, where missteps meant fatal plunges, where visibility meant sniper attention, where every successful transit represented another soul stolen from Nazi tallies. Vatican Swiss guards recognized O'Flaherty regardless of costume when he returned each night, nodding silent respect as this chameleon priest transformed back into clerical dignity within sanctuary walls, washing away disguises, but never the haunted knowledge of those still waiting beyond that white line Kapler had drawn across his conscience. The October darkness carried whispers of betrayal through Rome's ancient Jewish quarter when Kapler's trucks arrived at 5 in the morning, their engines shattering the Sabbath silence with mechanical brutality that announced the nightmare's beginning. Gestapo soldiers moved methodically through narrow streets where Jewish families had lived for 2,000 years, hammering on doors with rifle butts, shouting commands in harsh German that required no translation, because terror speaks every language. Mothers clutched children against their breasts, while fathers frantically searched for hidden valuables to offer as ransom, not yet understanding that Nazi efficiency recognized no negotiation, only quotas and deportation schedules written in Berlin offices months earlier. O'Flaherty received word at dawn from a breathless messenger who'd sprinted from the ghetto, and he immediately mobilized his network through predetermined signals, candles in specific windows, chalk marks on designated walls, bells rung in patterns that meant everything had changed. Within the Vatican, he moved like controlled lightning, pulling baptismal certificates from hidden folders, scrawling Christian names onto blank documents while his hand cramped from speed and urgency. The white line at St. Peter's Square became meaningless as refugees who'd escaped the initial dragnet began arriving in desperate clusters, some still wearing nightclothes beneath hastily grabbed coats, all carrying the haunted expressions of people who'd watched neighbors dragged into trucks. Throughout that endless day, Rome's convents and monasteries opened secret doors as O'Flaherty's couriers delivered the hunted to predetermined sanctuaries, nuns receiving traumatized children with gentle efficiency, while monks created false identities faster than fear could paralyze hope. He worked without sleeping, moving between safe houses in whatever disguise circumstances allowed, his tall frame somehow compressing into insignificance through sheer willpower and desperate necessity. German checkpoints multiplied throughout the city as Kapler's forces expanded their search perimeter, stopping anyone whose features suggested Jewish heritage, demanding papers while fingering triggers with casual menace. O'Flaherty passed through one such checkpoint disguised as a municipal worker, his forged documents claiming employment with Rome's sanitation department, his heart hammering while a young soldier examined the papers with agonizing slowness. The German finally waved him through with bored indifference, unaware that beneath the dirty coveralls walked the priest whose rescue network was systematically dismantling their carefully planned roundup. Each successful passage felt like temporary victory in a war measured by individual souls rather than territorial conquest, where every hidden child represented defiance against machinery designed to erase entire peoples. By midnight, over 1,000 Jews sat imprisoned in a military college near the ghetto, awaiting trains that would carry them toward destinations whose names meant nothing yet. Auschwitz, Birkenau, places that existed beyond imagination's darkest capacity. O'Flaherty stood at his window overlooking sleeping Rome, calculating numbers with bitter mathematics. 600 escaped through his network's intervention, thousands more beyond his reach, imprisoned behind walls his documents and disguises could not penetrate. The night offered no comfort, only the cold knowledge that morning would bring deportation trains, and that his work had merely postponed rather than prevented tragedy for so many families whose faces he would carry forever. He returned to his desk as church bells marked the new day, pulling fresh paper toward him, beginning again the forgery work that transformed despair into survival, one baptismal certificate at a time, knowing Kepler's hunters would intensify their surveillance, but understanding that stopping now meant surrendering to darkness that his Irish conscience absolutely refused to accommodate. Rome transformed into a city of shadows where entire lives existed in whispers between ancient stones, where basilicas held congregations that never appeared in official registries, and where O'Flaherty's rescue network created an invisible metropolis beneath the visible one that German patrols methodically searched. The safe houses multiplied across Rome like cells dividing in darkness. Apartments behind false walls where families breathed quietly during daylight hours. Monastery cellars converted into cramped dormitories where Allied soldiers and Jewish refugees shared stale bread and whispered prayers in different languages. O'Flaherty maintained meticulous records in coded notebooks, tracking locations and identities with system that balanced precision against security, knowing that discovery of his lists would unravel everything and condemn thousands to the deportation trains that departed Rome with terrible regularity. The network operated through layers of separation where couriers knew only their immediate contacts, where nuns delivering food baskets carried messages they couldn't read, where the whole operation functioned like a clock whose individual gears never saw the complete mechanism they powered through their small movements. The Vatican itself became honeycomb of hidden spaces as O'Flaherty exploited every architectural possibility within the neutral territory that German forces could observe but never enter, placing refugees in maintenance rooms, storage chambers, even within the Vatican's power station where the generator's constant noise masked the sounds of human presence. He moved through these spaces nightly like shepherd counting impossible flock, bringing news from the outside world, distributing forged ration cards that allowed the hidden to eat without revealing themselves, offering encouragement measured in careful words that acknowledged reality without surrendering to despair. The physical strain showed in his frame as months of sleepless vigilance carved hollows beneath his eyes and added tremor to hands that continued forging documents despite exhaustion that made letters blur across pages. His allies worried privately about his pace, knowing he drove himself beyond sustainable limits, but understanding that suggesting rest to O'Flaherty meant arguing against tide itself, futile and slightly absurd, given the man's absolute commitment. The hidden city developed its own rhythms and hierarchies as strangers became families through shared confinement, where children learned silence as their first lesson, and where adults measured time not by clocks but by footsteps. Passing overhead, that might belong to friends or hunters. O'Flaherty established communication networks using everything from laundry patterns to flower arrangements in specific windows, creating visual language that allowed safe houses to signal danger or request supplies without words that could betray intentions. The system's complexity amazed even its architect as he watched ordinary Romans transform into accomplished conspirators whose grocery shopping concealed resistance and whose casual conversations carried coded intelligence that kept refugees one step ahead of Kepler's intensifying searches throughout the occupied city. By Rome's liberation, O'Flaherty's records documented 6,500 souls sheltered through his network's intervention, though he never spoke numbers as achievement, but rather as individual faces remembered in prayers. He offered nightly for those he'd saved and those beyond salvation's reach. The rumble of Allied tanks entering Rome on the 4th of June 1944 reached the Vatican. Before dawn, a mechanical thunder that announced liberation and sent O'Flaherty's hidden city spilling into daylight after months of enforced darkness. Families emerged from monastery cellars blinking against sunshine that seemed impossibly bright. Children stepping into streets they'd known only through parents' whispered descriptions, while Allied soldiers liberated from prison camps embraced the Irish priest whose forged papers had kept them breathing through Rome's occupation. O'Flaherty moved through the celebrations with quiet satisfaction rather than triumph, his attention already shifting to practical matters, reuniting separated families, securing proper documentation for those whose identities existed only in his coded notebooks, ensuring that survival translated into actual futures rather than mere continuation. The Vatican's hidden chambers emptied slowly as their temporary residents reclaimed names and lives that German occupation had tried erasing, though the spaces themselves would retain forever the psychic imprint of fears absorbed into ancient stone during those desperate months. The network's dissolution felt almost abrupt after its months of careful operation. Couriers returning to ordinary lives, safe houses reverting to simple apartments, the invisible infrastructure dismantling itself with efficiency born from necessity rather than sentiment. O'Flaherty burned his coded records once all refugees found proper placement, watching flames consume the meticulous documentation that represented thousands of individual salvation stories, understanding that security demanded erasure even in victory's aftermath. His superiors at the Vatican regarded him with mixture of admiration and relief, grateful for his courage, while privately glad that his activities no longer threatened diplomatic complications with whoever might govern post-war Europe. The priest himself seemed diminished physically by liberation, as though the constant vigilance that had sustained him through occupation departed with the German forces, leaving behind exhaustion that finally claimed its accumulated debt against his ravaged constitution. Years later, O'Flaherty visited Herbert Kepler in prison, where the former Gestapo chief served life sentence for wartime atrocities. The hunter and hunted meeting across visiting room table in encounter thick with historical irony. They spoke quietly about Rome, about choices made under impossible circumstances, about the strange intimacy that develops between adversaries who understand each other better than allies ever could. O'Flaherty eventually assisted Kepler's conversion to Catholicism, extending mercy that baffled observers who couldn't reconcile forgiveness with justice, though the priest himself saw no contradiction. Saving souls remained his vocation regardless of their previous affiliations. When Kepler's wife smuggled him out of prison in a suitcase years afterward, O'Flaherty made no public comment, his silence suggesting that some ironies required no interpretation beyond their simple existence. The Irish priest died in 1963, his funeral attended by hundreds, whose survival traced directly to his wartime courage, though he'd never sought recognition for actions he considered simple moral obligation rather than extraordinary heroism. His legacy survived in lives that multiplied forward through generations, in families that existed only because one tall priest decided neutrality meant complicity and chose resistance despite personal danger. The Vatican eventually recognized him among the righteous among nations, though O'Flaherty himself would have found the designation uncomfortable, preferring to be remembered simply as someone who helped when helping mattered most. Rome's shadows that once concealed his rescue network now hold only memory, but the 6,500 souls he saved carried forward light that continues illuminating darkness wherever courage confronts evil and refuses to look away. What would you have risked to save a stranger's life in occupied Rome? Subscribe to journey deeper into history's most compelling untold stories.